another Earth Science video. We didn't do any for rock cycle. I wanted to see how it goes. I figured it was pretty straightforward. You probably didn't need these, but you might for this unit. So we're into lithosphere, and lithosphere is not, something you haven't studied before, but we're probably going to go into a little bit more detail than you're used to. Now, we're not going to do the whole thing here. We're going to break it up into different videos. So let's hit the highlights of what you need to know for the first part of lithosphere. Well, obviously, we can't go into the Earth. We can't drill down into the Earth. We can't go that far. We can't see what's going on. But we do know a lot about the inside of the Earth because we study either, earthquakes or volcanoes or the way the Earth formed through meteorites. We look at all this information and, scientists take this and they take that and they figure it out. And here's what we know. We know that the lithosphere is the top. It's part of the crust. It's part of the rigid mantle. That combines to the name of this unit, the lithosphere. We go a little bit further down, you take the rigid mantle, you go further into the mantle proper. And in this, we have two more subsections of the mantle. We have the asthenosphere and we have the stiffer mantle. Now on your reference sheet, you can go and look up all these different properties. You don't have to memorize the different properties of them, but I am asking you to know kind of the bigger names. Lithosphere, mantle, outer core, inner core, and the outer core and inner core are what's next. They're two inside most layers of the Earth. They're both made of iron and nickel, and they're both obviously metallic. Now, what's the big difference? Why are there two different cores? Well, the outer core is liquid. It's super hot. You can go look up the temperatures and see the temperature range on your reference sheet, but the inner core is too. So the difference? Pressure. The inner core has way more pressure pushing down onto it, compacting it, so that makes the inner core solid. Now, why does that matter to us? Well, it's not going to really make sense yet as to why we need to know the difference between the inner core and outer core, but we'll see when we actually start learning about earthquakes, it's going to make a difference. What do we care about though where we are? We don't typically, most of you will never ever probably think about the inner core and outer core once you take this test and this class is final again. I get it. I didn't think I would either, but why do we care about it? Well, we don't necessarily, but we do care about where we stand, which is on the crust. So we have the continental crust. The continental crust is much thicker than the oceanic crust, which is much thinner. However, what you need to know about this is that even though the continental crust is thicker, there's more, and it's definitely more thick underneath mountains, it's less dense. It's 2.7 grams per centimeter cubed compared to the oceanic, which is 3.0 grams per centimeter cubed. And we studied that when we studied continental drift. And Alfred Wegener's this scientist who kind of came up with this idea, but he could never answer how continental drift actually happened. So what he does is he has all this information, and later geologists and geophysicists come up and they discover all this information, but they never could find the mechanism which caused continental drift to happen. But they did eventually. So what's some of that obvious evidence? Well, let's look at the Earth. We can look at what we can see. We can go out right now. We can take trips to the mountains and see the stuff going on. We can see faulting. We can see folding. We can see tilting. Now, faulting is just a weak spot in the Earth's surface. We'll talk about that a little bit later. They move in different ways. Folding is what we talked about with metamorphic rocks. You put so much pressure on them, it compacts them. And instead of being a flat bed, it can bend them. You bend it enough, you get mountains. And the last one is tilting. Now, things in nature want to do the least amount of work. They want to expend the least amount of energy. So things want to form flat. Rock layers want to be flat. So if we go out in the field and we see that they're tilted, we know that something had to have changed it. It's not going to just form like this. It wants to form flat and horizontal. That's not enough though. We also can look at the shape of the continents and see that they can kind of fit together. Now, you've talked about Pangaea before, I'm sure, but you might not know that it was about 200 million years ago, and it was the last great supercontinent. Now, there's been other large land masses before in Earth's history, but you may or may not have heard those. Pangaea is the most recent one, with the continents that look most like what we are used to seeing. So how do we know that that happened? You can't go back 200 million years in history, so what do? Well, we look at different things like rocks and minerals, and we can see when they formed based on the dating of them. We can see what they're made of based on their composition, if you remember back to rock cycle. So we take this and we look and see when these rocks and the rock beds and minerals were made. Okay, maybe they're starting to match up a little bit. We can also look at mountains and see when they were formed and to see their properties and heights and weathering and erosion and all this stuff that's happened to them. Well, we see that those happen to match up as well. So now we have two parts of evidence that seem to kind of go along with this. We also look at things like post-glacial evidence. Glaciers that happened a long time ago that we don't see anymore because they're not there anymore because either the climate has changed or the continents have moved. Well, when we go to really hot places like, India and South America and South Africa and places like that are way too hot now to have glacial activity, we see that in the past they did. We can look at these marks and see what the topography looks like, and geologists know when they see glacial activity even though the ice isn't there anymore, and all of this kind of matches up too. But again, not enough evidence. Okay, so we talked about what we can see. We talked about the geologic history. Maybe the biological history will help us with this. Well, let's go look at the history of the fossils in the area. And we can see that plants and animals that had to have been together are now spread way out on different continents. And we can see that it's not something that they could just, walk across, these land bridges that may or may not exist anymore. And they're definitely not swimming across the entirety of oceans. So that's probably another great point of evidence. We can look at like the glaciers, we can look at plants that don't make sense or animals that don't make sense for the climates that they live in now. You take tropical plants, think Jurassic Park, think ferns, think palm trees, think stuff like that, and go and find them in Antarctica and Alaska. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So it had to have been in a different place. You also look at shallow marine organisms. You can look at things like ammonites, like seashells, or tiny fish that live closer to the shorelines and find them on top of mountains. Well, doubt they climbed up the mountain. So that mountain had to have uplifted after they had been, buried and deposited and became a fossil. It's not like, oceans just sit on top of mountains pretty frequently. So something had to have changed. So that's even more evidence for us there. But we're still not there. We have evidence. That's great. You need evidence in science because if you're going to change the school of scientific thought, you have to have a lot of evidence. We still haven't answered how, though. And that's something that Alfred Wegener could never answer for himself. And it wasn't discovered until after he died what actually made his hypothesis, or at least most of his hypothesis, correct. This is so recent that my geology professors, when they were in school, they weren't or had just begun being taught that continental drift was correct and that is how it happened. That's, 50, 60 years ago. That's really, really recent when you talk about scientific discoveries, especially when Einstein's theory of relativity was back in the 1910s and 1920s. So what is it? What is the how? Convection current and the mantle. Differences in density are what drive these convection currents in the mantle. Less dense magma rises to the top, more dense magma goes to the bottom. As plates get pushed up with less dense material at the mid-Atlantic ridge for us, it starts to push up and pushes out towards the continents. When they get to the continents, they subduct and they get pulled underneath. As you start to mix all this different types of material, it becomes more dense. You start pulling this 3.0 grams per centimeter cubed mafic seafloor back underneath. It's going to make the composition more dense. It's going to float to the bottom, or not float to the bottom, but sink to the bottom, and it's going to start churning back up until it eventually becomes less dense and rises to the top. We see this at plate boundaries, and we have three primary plate boundaries. We have divergence. That means they're going apart. The convection current is moving up, like from the bottom of the screen, and pushes them away. We have convergent, which is if it starts in the middle again, it's going to go to the bottom of the screen and it's going to pull the plates together. They converge like the other ones diverge. And the last one is a transform plate boundary. They're not going towards each other. They're not going away from each other. They're simply going by each other. No lithosphere is going to be created or destroyed here, much like when we talk about the different types of faults and a strike-slip fault, which might be something that you remember from the past. Nothing happens there. It's a shallow earthquake as opposed to the mountain building processes or volcanic building processes of the other two. So that's kind of a quick little rundown of the highlights of what's going on in that bit of the notes. We started at the beginning, we got to what the ocean floor looks like, and that'll be in a different video. Thanks.